How's it going, everybody? Check 1, 2. You guys able to hear anything? Trinity, send me a message on Canvas about it. Okay, so let's get started. We're picking up today in the story with England. Now that here, let me double check something here really quickly. Okay. So we finished the Dutch Republic last time, and now we're going to be talking a bit about England and particularly the period after Elizabeth I dies. So she dies in 1603. She doesn't have an heir. She is replaced by her first cousin. Was it twice removed? I thought it was once removed. But anyway, a distant cousin by the name of James VI of Scotland, and he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who became James I of England. So originally there had never been a James of England before, a King James. James I was originally King James VI, but of Scotland rather than of England. And so when he takes on the title King of England, he's the first King of England, and that's why he becomes James I. And this is a brand new dynasty known as the Stuart dynasty. The Stuart dynasty, it's an interesting period of time in English history. The Tudor dynasty is the one that Elizabeth I was a part of. The Stuart dynasty is going to experience a lot of change in England. We'll get to it. He was less than 1 year old when his mom, Mary Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate the throne and saw her for the last time. And he made only a formal protest when Elizabeth signed Mary Queen of Scots' death warrant in 1587 at age 21, when King James was 21. Okay, and so, even here's the interesting thing is, like, even though his mother was literally beheaded by Elizabeth, right? I mean, he wasn't very close with his mom and didn't know her very well, as was very common in those days, particularly among royalty, is that the royalty really didn't raise their own children because it was viewed as like a lower class thing to do. Other people raised your kids for you. And so, when King James I becomes the King of England, he's viewed by his subjects as vain, conceited, smart but foolish, awkward, an alcoholic, and very unkingly, if we can be honest about it. You know, when you're the King of England, there's an expectation of, you know, there's an expectation of decorum, you know, that you behave like a king, that you look the part, you dress the part, you act the part. Okay, there's kind of this belief that kings should be kingly, and James the First was just not very kingly. And two, he came down from Scotland, so he's a foreigner, so he speaks with a Scottish accent. Beyond his Scottish accent, he also had a speech impediment that caused him to kind of like spit and drool when he was talking. And, you know, a lot of times people around the king or in Parliament, they, you know, you could just imagine some of these like very prim and proper English parliamentarians like, oh God, have we got to listen to this for the rest of our lives? You know, this guy sounds absolutely awful. You know, you could just imagine them being like very, very disapproving of King James the First. And so King James the First was sometimes nicknamed the wisest fool in Christendom. He believed in this policy known as divine right of monarchs. The idea that basically God made me king, so any decisions I make must be of God's will, right? And James the First kind of looks at his situation that was not predicted that he would become, you know, King of England. Certainly, it's kind of by luck, I guess, because Elizabeth, you know, she didn't have any kids her whole life, and ends up getting nicknamed the Virgin Queen as a result of that. But, you know, James the First comes in there, and he kind of looks at a situation and thinks to himself, you know, how did I get here? And he says, well, it must have been God's plan. And so since it was God's plan for me to, you know, become King of England, that must mean that he wanted me to be king. And that whatever decisions that I make as king are God's will, which is a pretty convenient circular, rationale of something. But war debts from Elizabeth had been passed on to James. And so he's got some things to deal with in terms of coming down and handling business in England. Much of James the First's court were filled with yes men, incompetent people who were disliked by Parliament. And, Parliament at the time was made largely of English Puritan nobles. And James the First is more Catholic, retained the elements of Catholicism for the Anglican Church. He's a little bit apologetic to Catholicism, and that too is another reason why Parliament didn't particularly care for him. There was another interesting story about James the First. He had a fondness, we'll call it, for this courtier, this younger gentleman who lived in the court, the English court, George Villiers, who was also known as the Duke of Buckingham. And in fact, they discovered a secret passage that linked their bedchambers together at Apethorpe Hall, which is interesting, of course, always. Parliament ultimately rallied against James the First, refusing to accept his selling of offices, refusing to fund his conflicts abroad, and also denouncing his attempt to arrange a marriage between his son Charles and daughter of Philip II. So um, James defied Parliament, denying their privileges. Okay, and instead he arranged it with the daughter of Henry IV of France and Maria de Medici, Henrietta Maria. So basically, he arranges this marriage, if you will. He has a son named Charles. James I died in 1625, and he gets succeeded by Charles I. Excuse me, I keep on yawning over here. I'm absolutely exhausted. James I died in 1625. He gets succeeded by his son Charles, and I think that people were hoping that when James died, because Parliament by the end of his life loathed him, they were hoping that things would go better with Charles. But Charles I proved to be pretty indecisive, super, super shy. He spoke with a stammer or a stutter. He had also had a really rocky relationship with his own father, and they were hoping, maybe Charles, now that he's king, will be easier to handle. But to be honest with you, Charles I is in some sense even worse than James I. Parliament had been hoping, we didn't like your dad, you didn't like your dad, maybe we can get along, sort of a thing. But that's not how it ends up going. He just ends up further expanding this notion of divine right. And the Anglican Church was challenged by Puritans, English Calvinists who emerged under Elizabeth. They had been around for a while. Puritans, strongly guided by belief in predestination and individual accountability, spiritual devotion, discipline, and sacrifice. And they value personal worth, not ecclesiastical titles, and they opposed the bishops in the Church of England. Okay, remember, the Church of England was a very Catholic institution. A lot of times people thought that it was a little too Catholic in England. But when the English broke away for Protestantism, it was really because of King Henry VIII's desire to divorce his wife. He didn't necessarily have a hugely spiritually based argument. It was much more of a politically based argument as to why Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church. And so, because it wasn't really based on religious principles, ultimately what ends up happening, of course, is that the Anglican Church takes on a very similar resemblance to the Catholic Church, and they even have clerical figures and stuff like that. Well, the Puritans in England are not Anglican, right? The Puritans in England are Calvinists, and so they have real radical religious beliefs. And Calvinism spread in England, Puritanism spread in England first amongst kind of the gentry class. All right, and the Calvinists hated what was known as idolatry, which is where the Catholic Church would have a bunch of idols. Maybe it's like a vial of, blood of a saint, or maybe it's like a hairpiece that some famous church person wore or something like that. They collected these idols. And the Calvinists are not fan of the sacraments, stained glass, all of the glam and glitz associated with the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the Renaissance papacy, and then after that, you see construction of churches where you have just these massive cathedrals with decorated with Baroque style architecture and art, and that's all super flashy. It's highly ornate, it's highly ornamented, it's very it's very opulent looking, right? The Calvinists, the Puritans don't value any of that. To them, that's all materialism. That's all unnecessary, for the purpose of what the church is there for, which is salvation in their view. And so Calvinist churches in general, puritanical churches, were very simple, very austere, very plain looking. And so they, but anyway, the Calvinists made up about 10% of the total population in England at this time, and a third of them are gentry, but had much more influence and education as well. So of course that's going to stick out. Okay, so the Stuart dynasty. Under Charles I, Puritans became increasingly hostile to something known as Arminianism. And Arminianism is the notion of Calvinism without predestination. Okay, Calvinism without predestination. And Charles I became an Arminianist. And so supporters of Arminianism were called Remonstrants. And this related to Calvinism historically, but different doctrines cause most to see the two as opposed to one another. And so the difference relates to if people's will can overcome God's will. Okay, again, that idea of predestination by Puritans was that if you're a Puritan and you believe in predestination, that God's will is trumps all, that God knows all ahead of time, in past and in present, and as a result of that, knows whether or not you're going to be saved before you've even lived your life. Arminianism, on the other hand, basically said that people are not without the ability to exert will on their own lives. Okay? The Arminianists basically say, that people have the ability to make decisions in their own lives that could sway God's favor, okay? Versus predestination, very much of the belief of God's will being irresistible and choosing to save only some, okay? Anyway, this is what Arminianism relates to. And great fears or paranoia in England at this time of Catholic plots and popery and stuff like that. Popery just meaning like related to popes. Okay, popery. If you got accused of popery, that was like, you're being too Catholic. Of those trying to restore Catholicism as the main religion, and there's the British or the English rather after the plots that Mary the First had done to kill a bunch of her father Henry VIII's Anglican believers or Protestants. England really had a very, very, very almost obsessive, compulsive kind of relationship with Catholicism. Catholic. They were just really, really, really fearful of Catholicism and Catholic plots in England, taking hold and overthrowing the government or trying to force them to convert back to Catholicism. The English really retain a very strong chip on their shoulder for a long time about Catholicism, really for the next couple hundred years. So Charles I is the king at this time, and we can see some divisions developing. His fiscal policies deepened the dissatisfaction with his reign as he levied a forced loan on landholders without parliamentary consent. And, the story with England is that going back to 1215, there was this thing called the Magna Carta, which meant that kings couldn't tax without the consent of nobility in parliament. Now, back in this day, nowadays, Parliament is called together, basically every day, just like, it's like a regular full-time job, except for when they go on recess. But Parliament at this time, they had to call the nobles from distant regions of the land. So Parliament was typically only called together a few times a year back in Charles I's time. But under Charles I, it's even fewer times under Charles I than it was earlier. And in 1628, Parliament passed something called the Petition of Right by Thomas Wentworth. Okay, the Petition of Right, which Charles was forced to accept, okay, in return for granting the tax he wanted in place, because parliamentary rights were unalienable. Okay, this had been a precedent. The Magna Carta had been a legal precedent in England for 400 years by this point, more than 400 years. And so Parliament passed this Petition of Right, which basically Charles was forced to accept in return for granting the thing. But afterwards, Charles ordered the dissolution of Parliament in 1629. In other words, he basically dismisses Parliament, okay, dissolves Parliament, and just doesn't call them together for the next 11 years, all right? And he goes back on record to find all possible taxes that haven't been collected since feudal times, all right? Because he can't find the money to support this, the things that he wants to do in England, okay? The Parliament is refusing to pay him money unless he signs this Petition of Right. And he basically says, well, I'm not signing it. So you can go home and I'm going to find other ways of paying for it, whether I, have to beg, borrow, or steal to do so. And so one of the ways in which he does this is he finds this law called ship money, okay, or ship tax. And what this ship tax was it was mostly for port cities, but there were other places that you could collect it from. And it was basically a tax on ships that people had not collected for, a couple hundred years or something like that. People had kind of it was one of those taxes that was like an old practice, but it was kind of forgotten about. And, and so Charles finds this tax. And he's like, and then he informs all of these nobles, like, turns out there's this tax that you guys haven't been paying for the last 8 generations or something. So we're gonna need to go ahead and collect the taxes, the backed taxes that you owe to the state. For the ship tax. And rather than just doing it for the coastal cities, which is what the tax was designed for, he actually just does it for everyone. And the nobles, what are you going to do? It's a law. I mean, it's technically a law. And so he through a technicality was able to start collecting money. And you can imagine the nobles just absolutely must have been annoyed to the most extreme, because it's this tax that everybody had forgotten about. No one had collected it for a long time. And now he's going to collect all of the backed owed taxes. And so anyhow, all right. Royal debt. He also seized land from Scottish nobles. Royal debt, inflation rates, and costs of everything skyrocket during this time. The Scots, similar to the English, have Calvinism spreading around, and the Scots are trying to maintain the Presbyterian Church. Were furious at Charles's attempt to impose the Anglican Book of Prayer in their churches, and the Scots prepared to invade England. And so after 11 years of Charles basically ruling solo without Parliament, who he has dismissed, and after, seizing land from Scottish nobles, after trying to impose the Anglican Book of Prayer in Scottish churches, they prepare to invade. And Charles I at this point is absolutely desperate for funds. He calls on London, the city of London, which was London is not where the king resided. London London was like a city, a municipality, and cities are one of the checks to king's power in this time. And the city of London agreed on the condition that Charles convene Parliament and let them operate for a while, basically saying like, look, we'll pay for the war, but you have to call together Parliament. So the nobility and the gentry in the north were already starting to ally with the Scots because they hated Charles I so much. And in 1640, the Scots occupy the northeast English port of Newcastle. At that time, Parliament refuses to allocate money for the war against Scotland unless Charles I considers a list of their grievances. And he says, no, I'm not listening to your grievances. We've got a war to fight here. And then he dissolves what became known as Short Parliament after less than 2 months. This was a poor decision, okay? It was due to Charles's stalwart opposition to Parliament and his insistence that he should be able to be a divine right, absolutist style ruler that ultimately results in his overthrow. And so Charles I is doing the best that he can to handle the Scots invasion situation, but on top of that, he is also refusing to listen to Parliament, and he dismisses them again after he had just dismissed them for 11 months or 11 years. He brings them together. They're like, hey, we want to have you listen to a list of our grievances and so on. And you know, usually, here's the thing is Parliament isn't impossible to get to go along with what you want, okay? If you're reasonable, if your Parliament had historically been pretty okay with giving money to the king if the king demonstrated an ability to work with them, okay? If the king demonstrated, or queen, demonstrated an ability to listen to Parliament's concerns, hear them out, okay? They were usually, Parliament complains for a little while, but the expectation was you listened, you're the king, you listen to Parliament complain, and you do your duty as king, and then we give you the money, okay? And that's kind of how it works. And Charles I really did not want to do that at all. So this is where we see the beginning of what is known as the English Civil War. And it's sometimes called the Puritan Revolution. And it's where Parliament, which was led by Puritans like a guy named John Pym. John Pym was a puritanical leader in the English Civil War. And the whole reason, okay, of Parliament's existence was to protect fundamental English liberties so the king could not just go rogue and impose taxes as he pleased. You know, the king can't just act like any way that he wants. There are certain rules and regulations that Parliament and precedences and rights that Parliament have gotten used to. And so supporters of Parliament or country versus supporters of the monarch or court, as it's sometimes called. Okay, so the king, meaning like the king's court, right? So supporters of Parliament or country versus supporters of the monarch or court. And there's about 1,200 titled nobles who supported absolutism, but the gentry mostly opposed the king. Okay, so it's not like every single last noble in England hates the king. There are some that support absolutism, but the vast majority of the gentry mostly oppose the king. And Charles I famously once said, "No bishops, no king." Puritans call this popery. Anglican bishops could appoint state officials. All right, and basically, you know, the idea is if you don't have bishops, you don't have a king. And to them, that seemed very Catholic-y, okay? The English Civil War, okay. because remember, the Puritans are trying to get rid of the bishops, okay, because that's very Catholic. And Charles I basically says, you don't have bishops, you don't have a king. Anyway, English Civil War. The king attempted a coup against Parliament in January of 1642, and they led 100,000 soldiers into Parliament and ordered Pym's arrest and 4 others. But they were forewarned and had left before he got there. And so Parliament passed something at this time called the 19 Propositions, denouncing the royal policy. And at that time, civil war broke out. And you see 2 sides form. You have the side of the king or the court, which was called the Cavaliers, okay? The Cavaliers, the king's men, versus what became known as the Roundheads, which were the parliamentary soldiers due to their bowl-shaped haircuts that they had at that time. And so there's only 4 major battles of the English Civil War. Parliament had much support from the most economically advanced areas in England where commercial agriculture had developed, and this assisted them in their victory. But talking a little bit about the English Civil War, July 1644, the Roundheads, the parliamentarian side, allied with the Scots, and they defeated the Cavaliers at Marston Moor, led by a military leader by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell was deeply, deeply Puritan, and he was convinced that God chose him to be one of the Puritan elect. Remember, the elect were people who had a visible conversion experience and were, what's the word that I'm looking for? They were, because they had one of these visible, he was like he thought of himself as a visible saint and one of the elect. He thought that he was one of God's chosen people to go to heaven, and so as such lived a very outwardly pious life. And he was an idealist. He was stubborn and convinced that he was always right. And what he did was he combined 3 different armies. Parliament formed what became known as the New Model Army in 1645, where they paid for supplies rather than plundering towns like the King's Army. And the 2 political groups that emerged in Parliament were the Presbyterians at this time. Now, they're going to be essentially all Calvinist. The Presbyterians are Calvinists, but also you had the Independents, and they're more radical Calvinists or Puritans. And so the English Civil War, Cromwell purged the Presbyterian commanders within the New Model Army and replaced them with independents, okay? Troops loyal to him were known as Ironsides, okay? And England fell into anarchy and chaos from soldiers not being paid, food shortages, rising prices. And then you had this group known as the Levelers, who were far more radical, and they called for new laws to protect poor and wealthy folks. Most were Baptists and Puritans, and they based their ideas on property ownership, excluding wage laborers and servants and stuff like that. And so, there's some social chaos going on in England at this time. Basically, they have defeated the King's Army. The king is essentially being held, prisoner at this point, Charles I. All right, and you have a lot of infighting about Oliver Cromwell, who purges these Presbyterian commanders, despite the fact that Presbyterians are themselves Calvinists. And there are these political groups that are emerging between the Presbyterians, the Independents, and the Levelers. Okay, and so things are kind of crazy right now, and Parliament gets pressured by the Presbyterians. And orders the New Model Army under Cromwell to disband. which the independents viewed as a plot. And so Cromwell ruthlessly restored order in the New Model Army and subdued any mutinies that started to take place. And Presbyterian moderates end up switching sides and joining Cavalier uprisings. And Charles secretly met with Scots to negotiate a peace at this time. And it's the English Civil War is very peculiar in terms of the, religious aspects of it. So this was where there's something called rump parliament. Rump parliament was dominated by independents, and they appoint a high court to try Charles I of treason for secretly meeting with the Scots to negotiate peace. And then it abolished the House of Lords and established the Commonwealth of England with Oliver Cromwell as its leader. And it met from 1649 to 1653, and it would not dissolve itself. So effectively, what happens with Rump Parliament under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell is that it turns England into a military dictatorship. And Oliver Cromwell is the head of state, even though the name of it is the Commonwealth of England, where they were, quote unquote, attempting to implement a Republican-style government where people would have the ability to vote for representatives and stuff. It's far from democratic. Okay, the Rump Parliament was also the parliament that, when they try Charles I of treason, he is found guilty and he is beheaded. So they have beheaded their own king by 1649. And so the English Civil War, Puritan Republic, was as oppressive as the Stuart monarchy. So this new model army under the leadership of Cromwell, the Rump Parliament, and the this English Commonwealth, all of this is as oppressive as the Stuart monarchy was. Cromwell imposed taxes without parliamentary approval, just the same way that Charles I had been doing, and purged Parliament if they disagree. He gave de facto religious freedom to all Puritans, but continued to deny freedom to Anglicans and Catholics, although he did allow Jews to return in 1655. But, Cromwell, who also his name was Lord Protector, his title at least, died in 1658. And he gets succeeded by his son Richard shortly there for a short time after, for about 2 years. But Richard Cromwell just kind of failed at life a little bit. He was incompetent. The upper classes begin to rethink restoring the Stuart monarchy would bring back order to England, and so Charles's son Charles was in exile in the Netherlands at this time, and Charles the First is dead, but he had a son, and his son's name was, of course, Charles, and because that's what these guys did in these days. So Charles, the son of the king, is all the way back in the across the English Channel in the Netherlands. And so Charles II crosses the English Channel in May 1660 and comes back to England. And they basically say, hey, Charles, thanks for coming. We wanted to ask you if you want to be king. And he's like, well, yeah, of course. And so they crown him king April 23rd, 1661. He disbanded the New Model Army. Charles, unlike his father, Charles II had considerable charm, energy, courage, good humor, and loyalty to those who were loyal to him. So Charles II's a much more likable guy. Okay, he doesn't get along with Parliament at all times, but they definitely like him a lot more than they liked his father. And so the Church of England became the established Church of England, of course, and they expelled all those Presbyterian ministers. And the king once again became dependent on Parliament for funding. And, English shipping expanded greatly under Charles II. Their foreign policy was aggressively supportive of manufacturing and commerce and establishing this global empire, including in the North American colonies, which was a big part of Charles II's reign, was establishing, for example, New York as a colony as they took it away from the Dutch during this time. Charles II, by the time that England goes through some dark times, for a period of about 20 years there where the English Civil War is going on. And so, it's nice that they're able to move past the Cromwell years, which were really confusing for a lot of people and really, just not great times for England, very politically chaotic. And so bringing the king back and putting the king back on the throne, they restore. That's why we call it the Restoration. They are restoring their own king to the throne of the same dynasty as the last king. But you might be thinking to yourself, so wait a second. They fought against their last king, take him out of power, go through this military dictatorship for a while under Oliver Cromwell, and then what? Just decide to put the king back on the throne the same way that he would have been put on the throne? And they fought for 20 years for that, just to put the king back on the throne. And I can see why it would seem like it's a little insane. But the truth of the matter is that by Parliament making the decision to put Charles back on the throne, they are in some sense demonstrating their ability to do just that, and what Parliament will do later on. Charles II has a bunch of kids, but none of them are legitimate monarchs because they're with a bunch of different women. And he also has dogs. I don't know if you guys have ever seen King Charles Cavalier Spaniels before, but he had about 50 dogs or something, and he loved his dogs. And the King Charles Cavalier Spaniel is actually named after King Charles II of England. But anyway, he had a bunch of kids, but none of them were legitimate heirs to the throne. And so when Charles II dies, instead of the title going to any of his kids, the title goes to his younger brother. And his younger brother was, of course, named James. And so James II became king, but James II was Catholic. And so because James II was Catholic, they didn't want to keep him on the throne. So what Parliament does is they're basically like, okay, look, we get it, you're Catholic, but we can't have a Catholic king because we don't want any trouble. So we're going to go ahead and take you off the throne, and we're going to replace you with your daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. Don't get that William of Orange confused with the first William of Orange that we talked about, who was the William the Silent, the one who was the head of the military when the Dutch broke away from Spanish control. Okay, so anyway, let's see. I think there was one other thing that I was going to say. Oh yeah. So the point of what I was going to say is that because it might seem absurd to you that the English Civil War resulted in some sense them going right back to having their old king, but the power dynamic has shifted where the previous king, Charles I, has been beheaded. They replace him with his son, but the agreement kind of is like, look, we're asking you to rule, but if you screw it up, we'll fix it. Okay, like we'll take you out and replace you with someone else. So there does seemingly it's like you might think that they didn't make any forward progress, but in fact they did make forward progress because Parliament demonstrated its ability to subdue the king and implement a constitutional style monarchy eventually in England. Okay, they don't have it yet, but it's getting closer and closer to that. So, post-Civil War religious divisions. Charles II favored Catholics among his ministers, so Parliament passed a series of laws against dissenters known as the Clarendon Code from 1661 to 1665, and there's some different things about the Clarendon Code. The Act of Corporation required all holders of office to receive communion in the Anglican Church. The Act of Uniformity stated that all ministers had to use the Anglican Book of Prayer. Nonconformists had to take an oath that they would not try to alter the order of the church and state in England. And because many Quakers refused to take civil oaths, because Quakers only took, they only communed with God. Quakers had no interest in making promises in civil affairs or things like that, so they end up getting thrown in jail and left to die. And then in 1673, under Charles II, the Test Act got passed, which excluded non-Anglicans from military and civil office. So we're still seeing some religious divisions, is what I'm trying to say here in England after the English Civil War. And in 1679, Parliament passed the Habeas Corpus Act. Now, habeas corpus is a phrase that means you must have the body. Okay, habeas corpus is the idea that you can't be put in prison. It prevents against false imprisonment. Okay, and it forced the government to have a quick trial for people who were arrested, and that the people who were arrested or accused of a crime, that they had to be present in court. Okay, so that's where we get the idea of you must have the body. You can't just throw somebody into a dungeon and then leave them there indefinitely and hold a trial absent of having them there. But that used to happen all the time. And so they're changing that practice up. Forced the government to have a quick trial for those arrested and established legal rights for people who were accused of crimes. And so they're trying to create more due processes of law to make the law work in a known, orderly way. And then in 1681, Charles II tried to rule without Parliament for a period of time. He was kind of testing his limits there. A number of Whigs, who were parliamentary members who wanted Parliament supremacy and religious toleration, attempted to plot and kill Charles II and his brother James. And this happens pretty much right at the end of his reign, and they are not successful in doing so in 1681, but Charles II does die 4 years afterwards, and on his deathbed, he professed his Catholicism, which was always Parliament's problem with Charles II, was that he was just a little too Catholic for their tastes. And his brother became James II, who was already known to be devoutly Catholic, and fired officials who weren't. And this is not going to go over well with Parliament, who is largely going to be made up of Anglicans, right? So you have this glorious revolution in 1688. Basically, James II tried to make Catholicism the state religion of England again. And he admired very much the French absolutist state and how they did things in France. And Parliament is not going to let this happen. So Parliament puts his Protestant daughter Mary, who was married to Protestant Dutch stadtholder William of Orange, who later became William III of England. And basically, there's this group known as the Immortal Seven, 6 nobles and a bishop from the Church of England, invited William and Mary to restore Protestantism in England. And William hoped for English support against Louis XIV of France, because remember, the Dutch, he's the stadtholder of the Dutch, and they're struggling against the French in the late 1600s because Louis XIV is the absolutist ruler of France, and he's running military incursions into the Netherlands, and it's causing them a lot of problems. And so William hoped that this marriage to James II's daughter Mary would help, secure an alliance between England and the Dutch, who had their own previous wars against Louis XIV in an alliance, and reduce Anglo-Dutch trade tensions. So Louis XIV, one of the famous things that he had done in the absolutist era was he revoked something known as the Edict of Nantes, ending religious toleration of the Huguenots, which had been passed much earlier by Henry IV. You might remember the Edict of Nantes granted religious toleration to the Huguenots under good King Henry IV. Well, Louis XIV, a few kings later, gets rid of it. And the Dutch oppose this because they're mostly Calvinist, of course. And so are the Huguenots in France. And so when you're taking away their toleration, they're not gonna like that. The Glorious Revolution, much less dramatic than the English Civil War, and arguably longer lasting and more important. Basically, the Glorious Revolution, where they take James II out of power and they invite his daughter Mary and her husband William to take the throne. It's very significant because one of the first things that they do, so James II was only in power for about 3 years before he gets taken off the throne and replaced by his daughter and her Dutch husband. And by 1688, the Glorious Revolution has taken place. People are like, holy smokes, Parliament can basically just choose who they want to have as the king. And the first thing that William and Mary do as co-rulers of England is they ratify this Glorious Revolution and pass something called the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And what the English Bill of Rights was an affirmation of a reaffirmation of the rights of Parliament, and it guaranteed the rights of property owners to self-government, and of those accused of crimes and the right of due process of law. So basically, this reasserts Parliament's financial authority over the government and the dominance of Anglicanism versus, Catholicism in England. And it also reaffirmed the political domination of the gentry, and their economic and social position was secured during this time. So the English Bill of Rights is really super, super important to this idea of understood English rights, okay, held by particularly white males, okay, white British or English males who owned property, the gentry, okay. But it also established Parliament's superiority over the king, over the monarch, and increasingly, because England is now with this Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights is a document. It is in essence a constitution. And we, of course, have our own Bill of Rights here in the United States that are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. Now, our Constitution sets up a blueprint of a Republican-style government, meaning that people vote democratically for representatives who will serve us, and make laws on our behalf. England's Bill of Rights in this Constitution doesn't do that, but it does limit the power of the king and subdue the king's power to the power of Parliament. And so, this is not a democratically run institution that they have over here, but it is still closer to that than, say, absolutist France is at this time. Okay, so what you have to understand about this English Bill of Rights is it creates a special kind of monarchy that's unique to anywhere else in Europe, in Britain. And in Britain, the kind of monarchy that they have now is going to be known as a constitutional monarchy, whereby the king's powers are at any point going to be checked, undermined, subdued by this parliamentary body of nobles who are able to control the financial, economic, political, social aspects of government. All right. So that brings us to the end of today's lecture. I'll be making sure to put up an assignment here coming up soon. Probably in the next few minutes here, and get that done, and we'll see you again next time.